expect some other people to come, but we're planning to record the discussion here and also prepare a summary that we're going to publish and share it with a much wider audience, but we selected actually a number of people that we thought are interested in what we're doing. So first, let me right here introduce Hakim Pam, who is the Executive Director of the International Law Institute, and I asked her to make a few brief remarks to welcome the speakers and the audience.
Welcome to the International Law Institute. Thank you all for being here. Dr. Alexander had just asked me to say a few words about the Institute and our supports of the Inter-University Center for Legal Studies. The International Law Institute was founded back in 1955 under Georgetown University as a U.S.-German exchange program. We broadened our mission, and today we are an independent nonprofit training organization. We have broadened our mission to focus on training governments from developing countries on what we call fostered prosperity through the rule of law, which is to help countries achieve economic growth through having a good legal infrastructure and good legal systems. And the relationship that we have with Dr. Alexander and Dr. Brenner at the Inter-University Center for Legal Studies was we wanted to help, we understood that you could not achieve economic growth without peace. You could not achieve development and economic growth without peace and without rule of law. And we wanted, our initial collaboration took a look at how can we help governments from countries understand and have a definition for what is terrorism, since there still is no common definition for that. And once you have that definition, you're able to develop a work plan to address these issues. So we saw the collaboration as much of how the U.S. has realigned our foreign strategy is really with the 3 Ds, that defense cannot work alone, and that defense needs to work with diplomacy, and it needs to work with development. And so that is how we viewed the partnership. And we are really proud to be able to support Dr. Alexander in putting this wonderful panel together on this very timely and important subject on Syria and Iran and weapons of mass destruction. Because now is the time that we have to take a look at what is the role of the international community? What are the new norms that are being set? Who will be the new regulators? What are the new laws? Or is laws going to be enough? Or are there additional sanctions that can be done? And this is a very moving area. I don't think we know the answers yet. It's very, very fluid. And I think that it's great that we are able to sit here and really devote time to think about these issues and think about how will the international community, the regulators, be able to deal with this, and how will this be solved? Will it be solved through negotiations? Will it be solved through more bloodshed, or will it be solved through politics? I just wanted to welcome everyone here, and I hope we have an excellent discussion on this thought-provoking timely subject. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Kim, for your remarks. Please take some seats. Our colleague, Professor Don Wallace, who is the chairman of the International Law Institute, and we collaborated actually for at least, I would say, 3 decades with his work at Georgetown, and over the years we tried to develop various projects. I'm mentioning this because the question is, why should we have this session today on the weapons of mass destruction. Before I provide some context to our discussion, again, I would like to first of all welcome our panel, our speakers, for coming here from their busy schedule to share some of their ideas about the subject. And clearly, I would like to thank also, in addition to the ILI, the International Law Institute, to thank the other cooperative institutions. In this particular case, for example, we work very closely with the University of Virginia Law School, their Center on National Security Law. In fact, tomorrow on Friday, there is a major annual event dealing with the rule of law, particularly related to national security in town. So there are many institutions around the world in general that we're dealing with under the umbrella of the Inter-University Center for Terrorism Studies, the Consortium, and the Inter-University Center for Legal Studies. Now, I would like to mention specifically Mrs. Brenner, would you kindly sit down up front? And I'm so glad that you're here, because I was about to mention Professor Brenner's contribution to our work for at least 3 decades. As you know, we miss him every single day. When I say we miss him, because of his inspiration and wisdom. And we, of course, decided in his memory to remember the legacy. We do have, as you know, the center, which is the Edgar Brenner Center, and so forth. And as you know, we published a number of studies. I'm mentioning this because it is really important to look at the continuity of the work we're doing, and I will come back to the weapons of mass destruction. So the latest study report was just published in September. It's about Canada and terrorism, and Professor Brenner began work with us, as you know, in this field, and I will have a copy for you. Now, if I may, I would like to move on and to provide a very brief context to our discussion today. One thing I can promise you, that although the academic community is, at least in our work, trying to learn the historical lessons and reflect what's happening on the ground, I'm not going to speak on, or I don't think on the agenda today at least, to talk about the revelations that we are seeing almost every single day in spying, and the crisis of leadership and trust and all that. We're going to leave it actually to another session we're planning to have here on November the 7th, to really deal with the question whether the counterterrorism and democracy can coexist, and the rule of law and human rights and all that. But today we're going to try to assess the whole issue of the weapons of mass destruction. What is the next phase? What is the next step? And particularly, I think it is important to keep in mind that that particular issue is not new, obviously. those of us who are old enough to remember very vividly the Cold War and the Cold War challenges. From the academic point of view, I just want to make a few footnotes, again to provide the context. Dealing with the Cold War period and then subsequently the post-Cold War period. Now, academically, fortunately, we were touched by very wise people who contributed to our thinking, stimulated our thinking and research. One of them I'd like to mention is Justice Arthur Goldberg. As you know, subsequently he was at the United Nations, and in an introduction to one of our studies, he wrote, and I quote, "In modern terrorism with sophisticated technological means at its disposal and the future possibility of access to biological and nuclear weapons presents a clear and present danger to the very existence of civilization itself." And he wrote it in the early, actually, 70s, and we tried to follow his guidelines. And then, of course, many people work on this inside the United States and outside. I'd like to mention particularly two individuals that inspired us. One is Senator Nunn, and the other one, Senator Hoover, who provided a great deal of guidance on this issue. Now, again, because of our work, we looked at some of the terrorist groups and their interest in weapons of mass destruction. Of course, the Al-Qaeda group as one, and obviously we were interested also in state-sponsored terrorism, including some of our friends such as Pakistan and the AQ Khan network and so forth. So this is known, and again, academically, we have one colleague here from GW going all the way back when we tried to develop some activity and research in this field, establishing a task force to deal with that particular issue, which was really an international task force. And we were very blessed also to have people like Professor Edward Feller, who provided, again, inspiration and wisdom how to deal with the problem and became our honorary chairman. So, again, academically, it really goes all the way back. And now, basically, what we're trying to do is to revive some of the projects that we began a long time ago. One of them is known as the Middle East Weapons of Mass Destruction Free Zone. And the question is whether it is feasible at all or realistic. And here I see another colleague who just came, a physicist with whom, Tony, welcome. And I remember when we had the conferences, seminars, even in the underground in Switzerland, Geneva, to deal with the threat of weapons of mass destruction. Now, there is a great deal of information in the news on a daily basis, particularly related to Iran and their nuclear ambition. But again, it does certainly overshadow some of the other strategic challenges related to Iran that I'm sure many of you are familiar with, all the way from propaganda, psychological warfare, terrorism, maritime threats, etc., etc. So that's number one. Number two, we're dealing also with the challenge of chemical weapons and perhaps some others in Syria. Now, finally, I do hope that we will discuss not only the issues related to Syria and Iran in this area, but to also consider nations in the Middle East and beyond who have nuclear aspirations. And there is a long laundry list of countries who are actively involved in that area. We are very, very fortunate to have a panel which I think would provide some very extraordinary insights, I'm not talking about secrets, into the nature of the challenge. And I ask as a keynote, or at least to lead our discussion, if you look, I think we distributed, if I'm not mistaken, also a bio, so we can really save a little bit of time. So the first speaker is Charles Dolfer, who really needs no introduction. And I remember his many contributions to deal with that particular field, the United Nations and outside the UN. And as you know, he was a former special advisor to the Director of Central Intelligence for Iraq Weapons of Mass Destruction. He led the Iraq Survey Group on Weapons of Mass Destruction. He was also active chairman of the UN Special Commission on Iraq. And he contributed both professionally and academically to our work, and we're delighted that he's with us, and I asked him to begin to put it in some realistic perspective where we are today and what's the outlook for the future, and then we'll have the panel to follow up.
Thank you very much, Jonah, and Mrs. Brennan, the panelists. We're a small group, so I think probably you will want to guide discussion with questions. So I'll try to be brief, which I'll try. Can't promise. What strikes me about the situation in Syria, I'm going to set aside Iran for the moment, but is how far things have come and how fast. Let me just tick through a timeline. On the 21st of August, there was a massive use of chemical weapons in Syria, which provoked an international response. The UN, which had a team in Damascus to investigate other allegations of use, redirected that team to investigate that one. As that team was going forward, on the 9th of September, Foreign Minister Lavrov, Sergei Lavrov, who spent 5 years as the Russian ambassador to the UN during the height of the Iraqi issues, so he knows a lot about the UN mechanisms, the mechanisms which were applied to Iraq, and in his brain he certainly knows those lessons, how they might apply to Syria. But he said publicly, he said, we're calling on the Syrian authorities not only to agree on putting chemical weapons storages under international control, but also for their further destruction and for them to join the OPCW in the Chemical Weapons Convention. On the 10th of September, in other words, again, less than 2 weeks after this massive use, President Obama made an address to the nation where he was saying that he was going to ask Congress for the ability to conduct a military strike against Syria in reaction to this massive use, which from the United States intelligence was clearly assigned the responsibility to Damascus. So he said the goals were twofold, as he stated them, to deter and to degrade the Syrian chemical weapons capability. The next day, Kerry agreed to meet with Lavrov in Geneva to discuss the notion of doing this via a UN disarmament mechanism. So again, it's still now 20 days after that massive use. On the 16th, excuse me, I'm getting ahead of myself. On the 12th of September, a day later, Bashar al-Assad agreed to the Russian proposal, and at the same time, Bashar al-Assad told the Russian TV at the time that they would agree to accede to the CWC, and that this was not because of American pressure. On the 14th of September, Lavrov and Kerry agreed in Geneva to a framework for the elimination of chemical weapons in Syria. This laid out sort of the path ahead, which would use both the existing mechanism of the OPCW and the Security Council. They came back to their respective capitals. On the 14th of September, Syria acceded to the CWC. Coincidentally, about the same time, Aki Selstrom, the UN guy who was meant to investigate the 21st of August use of chemical weapons, he issued his report on the 27th of September, a month after that use. The UN Security Council passed Resolution 2118, which laid out the process and set the goals for schedule of getting rid of the Syrian CW program, its munitions, its production capacity, and its agent. At the same time, carefully choreographed with that, the executive committee of the OPCW, the executive arm that implements the CWC, passed a decision laying out the groundwork which it would use, or laying out the ground rules that it would use to apply to the Syrian disarmament. On the 1st of October, 3 days later, the first team enters into Damascus to begin their work. On the 11th of October, the Norwegians decided to, and the Nobel Committee decided to award the OPCW the Peace Prize for that year. The 16th of October, the UN named a coordinator for the joint work of OPCW and the implementing organizations set up under the Security Council. They named a coordinator, Sigrid Kaag, who is a Dutch national, knows the UN system, speaks Arabic. On the 27th of October, the Syrians submitted their declaration to the OPCW detailing their infrastructure and munitions and so forth, and that was judged to be in the ballpark by the experts at OPCW. On the 30th of October, the UN submitted its first report on status, which will make its way to the Security Council. That report said that basically the team had done the mission that had been assigned it, which was to inventory the sites, do a baseline survey of the facilities which Syria declared. They got to all of them except for 2, which may or may not have been important, but they were outside of a secure zone. They could not get to those 2 sites securely, but they reported that they had accounted for and destroyed, made in the terms of the UN, functionally destroyed the Syrian capability to produce CW munitions. I say all this because that's really lightning speed. You know, when you look at destruction and arms control over the past several decades, how is it that between August 21st and October, 2 months later, in essence, an entire capacity has been taken off of the table? It's an astonishing thing that something happened that quickly. And what I would just put to you as a question, why? Decades ago, when I was also involved in arms control during the Cold War, in my brain I had a sense that arms control agreements kind of came in 2, possibly 3 types. There were those which set useless limits. There were those which limited useless things. And then potentially there were agreements which limited useful things and set useful limits. But it was hard to me to find a lot of cases where that applied. In looking at the Syrian CW case, why is it that all of a sudden they agreed to do this? Why is it that now chemical weapons are almost taken off of the map? The remaining countries that are not a party to CWC include Egypt, North Korea, South Sudan, and Angola. There's 190 other countries who have acceded to the treaty. There's 2 who have signed but not ratified, Israel and there's the other, Burma. But we're now at a point where chemical weapons are kind of taken off the map, which means, at least on the part of state actors. The residual problem, of course, is non-state actors, and that may be a big problem. Let me just put a couple of questions out. I have my own answers, but just things to think about. All this is taking place in a much broader problem. Probably the only good thing that you can point to with respect to Syria and the whole region is that we now appear to be very close to getting rid of Syrian chemical weapons. That says nothing about the rest of the mess in the area. People argue about this. Does this convey legitimacy to the Bashar al-Assad regime, and is that not a negative? How does this ripple on in its effect with Iran? Is it a good example? Is it a bad example? I don't know. It's an interesting debate on all of those points. I would point to the role of Russia. Why is it Russia did this? It's very interesting. And Lavrov, as I described, he knows this stuff. He's very smart. He's much, I shouldn't say this, but he was one of the smartest people up at the UN in my experience. I don't think anybody other than Lavrov could have done this because A, he knew the mechanisms from the Iraq experience, but he also knew Bashar al-Assad. He would not have proposed this if he didn't know that Bashar al-Assad was going to come through on this deal. So in thinking about it, Russia's all of a sudden playing a very interesting role here. Let me just, one other kind of a thing to keep an eye on looking ahead. As I mentioned, there was a report on the use that took place on August 21st that the UN did. It was interesting, if you look at the annexes of that they have photographs and they have analysis of the munitions used. My guess is that those munitions will not match up on the munitions which Syria declared in its inventory. So what I'm suggesting here is that munitions, chemical munitions, may not necessarily be fully under the control of state governments. So, I think the leakage over to non-state actors, which I think is probably an area that you and your studies are kind of focusing on a bit. I think be prepared to see more of that. One other thing, just drawing on my Iraq experience. In the Iraq case, you will remember that Iraq had and used a lot of chemical weapons during the war with Iran. Iran was conducting these things which we came to call human wave attacks. And chemical munitions really saved the Saddam regime at that point. So I'm going to my point of, are these useful systems which we've now taken off the map or not? There is a utility. They were very, very useful militarily to the Iraqi army during the Iran-Iraq War in the 1980s. So, I find that in itself is sort of interesting. It's not like we're taking a weapon off the table which is without utility. There may be alternative, better ways of performing a military function, and maybe that's the case now. But I just observed that. It's an interesting point to me. Let me just finally say, I've kind of declared victory. It may sound like I've declared victory on CWC. We're not there yet. The agent, some agent, which is in final form, but largely precursors, still has to be either neutralized or removed from Syria. But I think there's a path forward on that. Of course, there is the risk that some of the rebel groups may see this process as not in their interest and may try to upset it one way or another. But I think the dialogue which is going on between the United States, Russia, some other European countries, suggests that there is a pretty good path forward. And certainly, by the standards which President Obama laid out in his speech to the nation, which was to deter and degrade the Syrian capacity. The process that we're going on now is going to achieve a greater degree of success on that score than the military strike would have. Let me stop there and save time to my colleagues.
Thank you very much. It's an excellent beginning to develop a dialogue here, and I'm going to ask first Greg Gross, who, as many of you know, was a former Deputy Assistant Secretary of Defense, and he also served in senior capacity, actually, in the U.S. Senate, working with Senator Dole, and he followed the events for many, many years. So I would like to invite you to come up here and to share with us some of your thinking in response to Mr. Golfer's questions and others as well.
Okay. Well, Yona, first I want to thank you and the International Law Institute for hosting this, because, what a task to take on, the intersection between law, weapons of mass destruction, terrorism, and this is a complicated issue. And as Charles suggested, we could go on for about 50 hours to talk about this and really not even begin to understand it. Charles, you laid out, I think, very well what clearly is a kind of success of sorts, and let's hope it continues regarding Syria. And you raised some questions, and I'm going to delve into those questions because I think they raise a set of issues that make this not look quite as good as just the focus on chemical weapons suggests. Specifically in the Syria case, I would argue that, first of all, the decision by Syria to get rid of the chemical weapons was, of course, a decision by the senior leadership of Syria based on motivational calculations that they have made regarding what to do about that program. And those decisions one can, parse and figure out what they were probably doing, but clearly it was a strategic decision that they decided they didn't need the weapons to accomplish their objectives in fighting the insurgency in Syria. And Russia's motivation, likewise, in part may have been because by doing what they did in a manner in which was quite embarrassing to the Obama administration, famously Secretary Kerry did not expect a positive answer to the proposal he made in passing. And I know John Kerry very well, and he's a man who does make many proposals. And it was an impulsive statement that led to this result. Not a bad result, by the way. And I give the Obama administration credit for having pivoted as quickly as it did. However, it was a decision to get rid of the chemical weapons. Russia has inserted itself in the Middle East in a way that it frankly hasn't been present since Henry Kissinger. And that has strategic implications. Secondly, in the end, from a more global perspective, and I would argue from the nuclear weapons perspective, which is also important, a potential victory by Syria, the Assad regime, with massive Iranian support, could serve and likely will serve as a mechanism, one of the ways that Iran continues to grow its influence, and I would argue continue to push for its potentially soon to be realized nuclear weapons aspirations. Finally, I will point out that Syria also had a nuclear weapons program. That was eliminated by military strikes by Israel, reportedly. Classified level, we probably would say more about that, but the point is that that was not done through negotiation, certainly not by non-proliferation regimes. So let's now talk about the other topic, really interconnected with Syria, which is Iran. The way I'd like to quickly talk about this, because I know we have a big panel and so on, is first of all to point out where we are now with Iran. As everyone knows, the negotiations, the interactions are going on even yesterday and today. In November, we're expecting more diplomatic meetings. I think it's November 7th and 8th, I believe, in Geneva, I believe. And there have been meetings of the IEAA, technical, legal meetings with the Iranians. Within all of those discussions, of course, the key Iranian figures in Tehran continue to say that they will not cease and desist the further production of 20% level enriched uranium. And I think everyone here knows what that means. In fact, there has been no reduction in the Iranian program since a delay or cessation of sorts that happened in the middle of the last decade during the Bush administration. Iran continues the program. There's no evidence they will not. And of course, people who know Rouhani's history, who know the history of the current Minister of Defense of Iran, know the history of some of the key people that were now in power but were parts of the Khatami government, who expressly said back then and even earlier this year, things like negotiations, the climate of negotiation, quote unquote, allowed us to continue to improve our technologies. Obviously, there's more that the current administration knows than anyone here. I would hope that they understand the importance of the actual knowledge of what the Iranians are actually doing as opposed to what they're saying. Rouhani has a history of being a hardliner, but who talks sweetly. And in fact, he and his kind in Iran have consistently basically bragged about this. They literally have bragged about their success using sweet talk while simultaneously continuing their nuclear program. So what I would recommend be done about Iran, which I think is what we're here to talk about in part, because nuclear weapons are a game changer in the Middle East, is number one, it has to be understood that an Iranian nuclear weapon is a vastly worse thing than, for example, a North Korean nuclear weapon. You know, I remember the debates back during the Clinton administration about whether military action should have been taken against North Korea. Some of the hardline side of the Republican Party were advocating military strikes, and the Clinton administration believed that negotiation, most tellingly with the '94 agreement, would solve the problem. It didn't solve the problem. Korea has nuclear weapons, continue to proceed with them, but you could argue that we are kind of learning to live with that problem. We're managing it. Maybe not. We'll see. But what I would recommend, number one, is the administration needs to educate the American public about what's actually at stake. They did not do this with Afghanistan. They have to do it with Iran. Secondly, we need to rebuild, I would argue, the coalition of regional powers, regional partners, allies, partners, friends in the region that share a like desire to stop the Iranian nuclear program. I think many of you who follow this closely understand that Obama administration actions in Syria, in Egypt, Syria in the case of promising aid but then never delivering to the insurgents, making deals with the Russians that, in the view of many of our partners in the region, they believe secures the Assad regime. Our policies in Egypt, which have caused fury on the part of key allies. You know, first of all, we supported the Mubarak overthrow. We supported Morsi. When Morsi was overthrown in the non-coup, we ended up cutting military aid to the Egyptians. I'm hoping that the administration knows more than I knew about what is actually going on there. I hope that this is more for show, because clearly the Egyptian military leaders that are now in power understand the problem of Iran. And they, by the way, also support existing treaty obligations that Egypt has committed to for several decades. And of course, Iran itself. Our way that we're dealing with Iran, it was done without consultation with our allies in the region, has caused great concern. I would recommend everyone here, if you haven't, look at David Ignatius' piece in the Washington Post last week. He described the U.S.-Saudi relationship as, quote, a crack-up, quote, a slow-motion car wreck that has been on the way for more than 2 years, unquote. And 2 weeks ago, Saudi Arabia refused to take its Security Council seat in what many people know him, Prince Bandar, who was the ambassador here for many, many years and a friend of the United States, what Prince Bandar described as, quote, a message for the U.S., not the United Nations. I think we've already gone through the U.S.-Egyptian relationship. United Arab Emirates doesn't trust the U.S. Jordan has had meetings with the King of Saudi Arabia, and these are more quiet statements, as is befitting the King of Jordan, who is known for being, like his father, an extraordinarily diplomatic and effective sovereign. And of course, Iraq, which is a complicated figure in the issue of dealing with Iran. But Iraq is, as everyone here knows, now facing a problem that is unprecedented since the surge. Levels of violence. Every day there are multiple explosions. Al-Qaeda in Iraq is now present in ways that it hadn't been for several years. And General Petraeus just had a piece in foreign policy where he lays out what he did and the surge, how it succeeded, and how now the Iraqi government has to do that again. I don't think they'll be able to do that. And we're not going to go back in there the way we were, but that is a problem. So now, and then the other thing is Israel. I'm not going to go through that relationship and the problems regarding Iran. They're obvious. And finally, in coalition building is the issue of France and the United Kingdom, Europe in general. The reasons I don't understand, and I suspect it's I don't know why the administration has publicly criticized the United Kingdom on its handling of the Syria military action vote in the House of Commons. I happen to have worked at the House of Commons for several years in the mid-'80s, and I learned a lot about how that system works. And the vote that occurred in the House of Commons was a major blow to Cameron's credibility. And an ally and friend would have reached out to Cameron and provided him with political and diplomatic cover for what was a serious political defeat by the Prime Minister, who is a friend of the United States. Instead, the White House did this explicitly, heaped scorn and ridicule the United Kingdom and of the Cameron's leadership in trying to get that vote. That was a mistake. France, I lived in France for a number of years. I love the French. They can be great allies in places like Africa and elsewhere. But the United Kingdom, its relationships, its capacity in military and other things in the Middle East is second only to ours. So that's the second thing. Third thing, administration is trying to delay further congressional sanctions. Mark Kirk, junior senator from Illinois, is pushing for a strengthening of sanctions resolution. The White House is fairly publicly letting everyone know they don't want that. They want it delayed. I would argue that instead the administration should be using that threat of tightening the sanctions as a useful tool for negotiations with Iran. Fourthly, I should say, the Obama administration has suggested that Iran fulfilling its obligations is our maximalist position. This is a quote coming from them in the negotiations. This, of course, is short-sighted and dangerous. To the contrary, the administration should instead be pushing strongly in a committed way for tough, they should have clear goals that are tough in these sanctions. They shouldn't hold back from that. And I'm afraid they are actually doing so. And of course, yes, the answer is negotiate. But overall, the last thing, there's a often said, I think Santayana, the thing that don't repeat the mistakes of history. Well, one of the problems with that is it's a truism. We shouldn't repeat the mistakes of the past. But it's just as true that we often end up wrongly applying the lessons of the past to new, different situations. And I'm afraid that's exactly what we're doing in the case of Iran. The Obama administration is doing everything in its power not to repeat the mistakes of Iraq. They're doing everything in their power not to repeat the mistakes of what they argue is a unilateralist United States approach, when what they may be doing is replacing the mistakes of Iraq with the mistakes of North Korea in 1994. We had a final agreement that was supposed to basically solve this problem, and of course the North Koreans violated it almost immediately. And so that's a short, the other two really quick things, missile defenses for regional partners. We have to expand the program. This is something that was being pushed at the end of the Bush administration. I was involved in this to some extent, and we need to expand on that. Likewise, we cannot push for further reductions in strategic weapons. That is a bigger point, but when we do so, we end up actually incentivizing small powers like Iran to further develop nuclear weapons. This is the opposite of how some people view it. We need to set an example. If we bring our nuclear weapons down further, others will follow. But of course, the bad actors like Iran, North Korea, and Syria, until recently, hopefully, they don't think that way. They like weakness because it allows them to feel they have more capabilities. So that's a short, hopefully, it wasn't too long, beginning of my part of the discussion.
Thank you. Thank you very much again for trying to address some of the questions that Charles raised and trying to explain, I think, the panorama here in terms of other actors. And we don't want to make it a little bit complicated at this point, but we must play the run in terms of the non-state actors involved in Syria, and actually the globalization of the Syrian conflict, which has many consequences. Now, our next speaker is Michael Eisenstadt. Currently is the Senior Fellow Director of the Military Security Studies Program at the Washington Institute for Near East Policy. Michael contributed a great deal to our strategic thinking for many, many years. I wouldn't say decades, but
I'm not sure that's a good thing.
At any rate,
right now, but anyhow.
I think it's training the next generation, and we have a few people here from the Washington Institute. I really asked him again to respond to some of the questions and raise his own, and perhaps deal not only with the Syrian and the Iranian, but maybe other nations in the region, such as Egypt, etc. So you have a open-ended agenda.
But not an open-ended amount of time, so try to be quick. Thank you, Yona, for your very gracious introduction, and the International Law Institute and the co-sponsors for arranging this panel. What I thought I would do is just toss out some thoughts about, first of all, Syrian motivation in agreeing to dismantle its CW program and its implications for Iran. In particular, what lessons did Iran draw from this episode, and what are the likely impact of this decision on nuclear negotiations with Iran. Now, first thing I just want to talk about is immediately after Syria signaled its agreement to act in conformance with the framework agreement between the United States and Russia, Secretary of State Kerry said that the credible threat of American force was a key factor in accounting for the Syrian decision. I think it's hard to avoid the conclusion that it probably played a very important role. And what's odd is even at the time that Syria accepted the Russian plan, it seemed clear to at least many people in Washington and the United States that the U.S. already was not going to strike by then. So there seemed to have been actually kind of a disconnect between the Syrian decision and actual political reality in Washington, and how to account for that. And I would say, well, it may be in part due to a delay in comprehension of what was going on in Washington. Maybe it was a failure to understand how the U.S. system works, that maybe they thought that Obama would act anyhow, whether or not the public and the Congress was opposed to it. He was probably under a lot of pressure from the Russians, trying to convince him that this was actually a pretty good deal for him. And I think actually, based on what Assad has said in interviews since, he was probably convinced. I mean, I think he probably concluded, and again, this is speculative, and I got to be very careful about this because time and again we've been wrong about WMD motives and rationales, but it seems that I think you can make a very good case that Assad concluded that CW is more a liability than an asset at this point. He found that limited use really produced only limited benefits, and massive use invites foreign military intervention. And as a result, you know, one thing that I think, and I've been saying this for a long time, is one thing that's become clear as a result of the fighting in Syria is that conventional arms are the true weapons of mass destruction in Syria. And as a result, again, like I said, the limited use of chemical weapons really did not produce very heavy casualties or very significant psychological effects. And then when you win big, the United States comes in and threatens to strike. In addition, agreeing to the Russian plan ensured that the U.S. had a compelling interest in the survival of the Assad regime, at least for as long as the CW disarmament process continued. So I think from his point of view, it gave him a new lease of life. It provided, agreeing to this, to disarm, provided him with political cover against an American strike, and at least a lease on life through the duration of this process. Also, I think, you know, it's quite possible, you know, we've heard complaints about Russian replenishment of Syria's conventional arsenal. It's possible the Russians threw in some sweeteners at this time, and there were some newspaper reports that, you know, at the time that the U.S. was threatening to strike militarily, that Russia would replace any losses, and I think it's possible he said that, look, you're going to win this fight conventionally, and we'll make good any losses of conventional arms to make sure that you prevail. Again, it's a bit of speculation on my part, but I think we see enough in the media that there's reason to believe this may have happened. Although I will just say, as far as I can tell, the regime's real problem is not a shortage of arms. A lot of the army has melted away. They only could rely on really 3 or 4 divisions. So they have equipment from about 8 other divisions, which is sitting in some of it's been looted and taken by the opposition. But what they really need is reliable, competent manpower. And that, in the interim, has been provided by Hezbollah and Iran. But maybe the arms played a role as well. Finally, the last thing I'll say about Syria is that at the time that the Assad regime concluded the agreement, there were a lot of people saying, when he cheats, he will cheat, and when he cheats, we have to be ready in order to play that. I would just say that, look, I don't think we should assume that Syria will inevitably cheat on this agreement for the reasons I think that I explained a moment ago. I would also highlight, in recent years, Assad has not honored, or he has broken almost every agreement he's concluded with the opposition and the international community in the context of the civil war. But there was a time when it was a conventional wisdom that Hafez al-Assad, his father, keeps all his agreements. Now, the fact of the matter is the caricature wasn't exactly true. Assad was very punctilious, the father, was very punctilious in observing the disengagement agreement in the Golan. That is true. But he found other arenas, mainly Lebanon, providing arms to Hezbollah, and Palestinian groups to act as proxies for him. He found other nasty ways to pursue his interests. And I think we're seeing that actually in a way play out here, that as Assad, at least so far has, Assad the son has stuck to the letter of his agreement with regard to chemical arms. He's engaging, he's starving out, large numbers of Syrians and continuing with the conventional fight. So, I'll just say that, again, things might change. He might find reason to renege later on disarmament, but don't assume that. I think it's quite possible we'll see this agreement largely implemented. It's quite possible. Now, in terms of implications for Iran and lessons that Iran drew, there was concern at the time of the American stand down that this would harm America's ability to pressure Iran into an agreement on nuclear weapons. And in fact, even the president said, don't draw the, speaking to the Iranians, don't draw the wrong conclusions from Syria. What I did in Syria doesn't necessarily apply with Iran, and all options are still on the table. My feeling is that from the get-go, Iran was not as concerned about an American strike as I think some people think they were. And what happened in Syria only compounded that problem. And this was a pre-existing problem as a result of 30 years of American policy towards Iran, where the main American approach to dealing with Iranian terrorism and the like has been economic sanctions, and the main form of escalation control has been American restraint. We've never retaliated militarily for Iranian terrorism, and perhaps that was appropriate in each case, whether you're talking about Marine barrage bombing or Hobart Towers. Maybe it made sense in each case. But what we've done is socialize the Iranians to believe that they could get away with certain things without dealing with the prospect of military retaliation. So we already had a credibility problem to begin with, and I think this Syria, the recent episode with Syria, compounded it. What they really are worried about is what they call American soft warfare, or kind of what they see as American efforts to undermine the ideology of the regime and Iranian culture with American culture and the like, in movies such as Argo and the like. That's actually, believe it or not, that is what I think they really fear more than anything else, because it'll undermine the ideological underpinnings of the regime. And in the end, if you can't create a new generation of Iranians who buy into the ideology of the regime, the revolution and the regime will ultimately collapse and fail. And that's what they really fear about. That's what they're really fearful of. And I think no administration has really, whether the current one or previous ones, have recognized this fact or shown a willingness to act on it. But it would require a very different policy approach for dealing with Iran. So another thing that actually came out of the Syrian agreement, some people raised the possibility that, well, maybe the Iranians draw the conclusion that since we showed that in Syria, we're actually willing to live with regimes that they thought we were trying to get rid of, maybe they'll realize that actually we're willing to cut a deal with the Islamic Republic and live with them. I would argue that actually they'll probably draw another lesson. They'll look at Syria as perhaps Libya redux. In other words, or redo of Libya. That, we made, at least on a tactical basis, peace with Gaddafi in order to disarm him, and then when given the opportunity, we worked for his overthrow. And that's the game plan we're going to probably pursue in Syria. So I think from their point of view, their perception of American motives and American perfidy is so deeply rooted that they're unlikely to see, kind of the optimists, silver lining that maybe they'll conclude that a deal is possible on the nuclear issue, because we've cut a successful deal so far on chemicals. Let me make my final points here with regard to Iranian red lines in the nuclear negotiations and where things are heading with regard to that. Again, we don't know the details of what the Iranians, the Iranian presentation to the P5+1 in the meetings a couple of weeks ago, but I think you can identify from what they've been saying publicly their red lines. They talk repeatedly about a recognition of Iran's, what they call Iran's inalienable right to enrich. They said no more suspensions of enrichment. They've done it in the past, it's something of the past. Rouhani himself has said that. They said that actually building a bomb is a red line for them. They don't have the intention to build a bomb, but there's a nuclear fatwa which prescribes that. And in order to reassure the P5+1 in the U.S. on this, they're willing to agree to greater transparency to build confidence. I've actually written with a colleague about the nuclear fatwa issue, which I think actually fatwas can be issued and rescinded or modified according with circumstances. So I don't take that assurance at face value. But that's what they've been trying to convince the world is a red line for them. And then finally, not acknowledging a possible military dimension to their program is also a red line for them. At least that's my perception. Because so much of their narrative is built on this perception of grievance, that the international community, the United States in particular, is lying about what they've done in the past. It's really, what we're trying to do is keep Iran down, prevent them from acquiring advanced technology, and therefore it would be very, very hard for them to admit to having done military R&D, having a military component to their nuclear program in the past. It's always hard for countries such as South Africa and others that had to come clean, but here it's so woven into their narrative and their narrative of grievance that I think it will be very hard for them to do so. So what does this mean in practical terms? And I'm wrapping up now. I think they'll insist on some kind of centrifuge program. They might accept limits on the number of centrifuges and the percent of enrichment, but not the quality of centrifuges. And for us, if they don't accept limits on quality of centrifuges, that's a poison pill, because right now there are centrifuges in the world that are 100 times more efficient than the ones that they use, and we are developing ones that are 300 to 500 times as efficient. So you have to think, if they're allowed to keep 1,000 or 3,000, 20, 30 years down the road, they could potentially 1,000 or 3,000 of these much more efficient centrifuges could really give them much more potent capability. Likewise, with regard to the additional protocol, I mentioned before, Rouhani has talked about greater transparency, but they talk about it in terms of international law and regulations. So they might accept additional protocol. Their negotiator has said the parliament has to approve that. We could go into that in the discussion, why they're saying that. They haven't always given Parliament a veto. But the bottom line is, the additional protocol is not enough. And any kind of monitoring regime has to be much more intrusive in the additional protocol. And one principle of Iranian arms control policy is pushing back against what they perceive as discriminatory provisions. And any kind of additional protocol plus would be, from their point of view, discriminatory, because they'd be the only country in the world subject to that kind of monitoring. And therefore, I think that's a poison pill for them, and they're not going to accept anything more. So, in short, I think it'll be very hard to get a deal, but who would have thought that we would have gotten a deal on Syria? But again, I'm not sure that necessarily transfers to the Iranian case. So I'll conclude on that, and thank you.
Thank you very much. If we think it's complicated, we're going to see soon it's even more complicated, and I'm going to go to Dr. Milton Honig, our colleague, going all the way back again to the 80s when with Paul Leventhal we produced some studies on preventing nuclear terrorism, and we're still worried about that, I imagine. So I asked Milton to share with us his thinking about, again, where we are today in light of the dialogue and discussions, and how does he identify maybe the dangers or challenges in the future.
Well, thank you, Yonah. It looks like everything has been said that needs to be said. I remember when I was in high school, I memorized the first few lines of Cicero's first oration against Catiline. Don't worry, I won't repeat it today. I will start, however, by noting that weapons of mass destruction depend on both materials and delivery systems. The Chemical Weapons Convention concentrates heavily on oscillating materials and destroying them. As we see now with the 1,000-ton chemical weapon precursors declared in Syria that Charles and others have talked about. Materials are the key. No chemicals, bio, or nuclear materials means no WMDs to deliver. Nevertheless, in the nuclear arms reduction treaties between the United States and Russia, the focus is on reducing delivery systems. That leaves the nuclear materials to be reckoned with. The fissile materials, uranium-235 and plutonium, can't be easily destroyed. They can be diluted, isolated, and guarded. Under the strictures of the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty, and states agreeing not to pursue nuclear weapons, a great deal of effort is spent by the International Atomic Energy Agency to verify that nuclear materials and facilities are used only for peaceful purposes, mainly to fuel research reactors and power plants. The security of highly enriched uranium plutonium left over in Russia from the Cold War has long been a concern. In 2010 and 2012, at the behest of the United States, nuclear security summits were held to consider matters about the security of these materials and others related to securing the global accumulation of nuclear materials usable for nuclear weapons. The third summit is scheduled for The Hague in 2014. So 500 tons of leftover highly enriched uranium in Russia has been diluted with natural uranium and blended down to low-enriched materials sold to the U.S. over the last 2 decades. And here it has been used as a major source to fuel our nuclear power plants. Weapon-usable nuclear materials carry a persistent threat, as developing technologies make their manufacture and misuse even easier. The United States is trying to promote a policy that countries building their first nuclear power reactors will agree not accompany them with local uranium enrichment plants or fuel reprocessing plants. The U.S. does this through so-called 1-2-3 agreements that place restrictions on the subsequent use of U.S. origin fuel and technology. These agreements are, made with the individual countries. For example, the United Arab Emirates, which is contracted for South Korea to build 4 nuclear reactors, now has a 1-2-3 agreement with the U.S. in which the UAE agrees to abide by the Golden Rule. That is, no accompanying enrichment or reprocessing plants in the UAE. Rather, fuels be bought from foreign suppliers. South Korea itself, which is a supplier of the UAE, is in a standoff with the U.S. It wants a revised 1-2-3 agreement to allow uranium enrichment and fuel reprocessing, not only indigenously, but as a sweetener to accompany the sale of power reactors to other countries. This would further the spread of fuel enrichment and reprocessing throughout the world, rather than encouraging the ultimate non-proliferation goal of just a handful of multinational fuel cycle centers. South Korea claims that dry reprocessing technology it wants to use, so-called pyroprocessing, which was developed at the Argonne National Laboratory in Chicago, is proliferation resistant because recovered plutonium is accompanied by other fission products that would provide a radiation shield against seizure by terrorists. But this shielding won't deter a dedicated proliferator, who can simply use the long-proven Purex process to separate out plutonium from the other elements in a vat of acid. Enrichment and reprocessing technologies are potentially dangerous things. Look at Iran, as has been discussed widely here. At the Natanz centrifuge enrichment plant, Iran enriches the gaseous molecule of uranium and fluorine called uranium hexafluoride. Iran is producing 240 kilograms of 3.5% enriched uranium hexafluoride per month in 9,000 operating centrifuges. This is appropriate for power reactor fuel, but is not being used for that purpose at the present time. Iran's operating power reactor is being supplied by Russia with fuel. Instead, a stockpile of over 6,000 kilograms has accumulated, enough for 4 or 5 nuclear weapons, and further enriched to 90% weapon grade. That would take a few months for a single weapon. Iran also has been enriching uranium to 20%, as has also been mentioned, both at Natanz and a small enrichment plant at Fordo, built in the side of a mountain. It says that this uranium is to fuel its small research reactor in Tehran, but it has been careful to keep the supply on hand at about 180. Iran has been careful to keep the supply of 20% enriched uranium on hand at about 180 kilograms, below the red line, speaking of another red line, last year drawn by Israeli Prime Minister Netanyahu at 240 kilograms of 20% enriched uranium hexafluoride, the amount Iran would need for a weapon, if further enriched to weapon grade, something that would require just a few weeks. Iran could also have concealed secret centrifuge plants. The point is that an operating centrifuge plant has no identifying signatures. It could house tens of thousands of spinning centrifuge machines in an average-sized facility. The plant does not have any unusual requirements for electric power, and it does not emit any identifying chemical gases or vapors to the environment. Even more dangerous is using laser isotope enrichment. Iran has admitted to experimenting with this for enriching uranium, but it won't supply the details to the IAEA. Laser isotope enrichment, LIS for short, is the next big proliferation worry. In the U.S., GE Hitachi has been licensed by the Nuclear Regulatory Commission to build a commercial laser enrichment plant in North Carolina using the successful Australian SILEX process. Weapon-grade uranium enrichment in a clandestine LIS facility would be fast and very difficult to detect. In the negotiations now going on between Iran and the 5 permanent members of the UN Security Council plus Germany, the P5+1, the elephant in the room, as Michael actually just mentioned, the elephant in the room is Iran's nuclear-related activities with possible military dimensions, PMDs for short. These past activities have been cited by the IAEA and beg further explanation that has not been forthcoming. For example, the IAEA has evidence of experiments on the symmetric placement of detonators on hemisphere high explosive, an arrangement that would be appropriate for creating the converging shock wave in an implosion nuclear weapon. And there is evidence of work on the design of a compact warhead to fit into the nose cone of a Shahab-3 ballistic missile. In the documents obtained by the IAEA, Iran never mentions the word nuclear, but the nuclear weapon context is unavoidable. In addition, the IAEA would like to investigate explosives tests in a chamber at the Parchin military site, to which it has been denied access, while the site has been thoroughly cleaned and stripped of its possibly contaminated topsoil. Monday and Tuesday, last Monday and Tuesday in Vienna, experts from the IAEA and Iran met again to try to work out a structured approach to answering the IAEA's questions. A joint statement described the talks as very productive. Getting answers to the technical questions will be important for achieving successful negotiations at the higher level by P5+1. Another matter that is likely to come up in a negotiated agreement is the need for enhanced safeguards, again Michael mentioned this, on the surviving elements of Iran's enrichment program. These would go beyond the additional protocol to its comprehensive safeguards agreement with the IAEA. Iran adhered to the additional protocol between 2003 and 2006, allowing inspections of suspect nuclear sites. Enhanced safeguards would allow more frequent inspections, remote camera monitoring, and more extensive environmental monitoring, among other things, to increase transparency. Enhanced verification is strategic to a Middle East weapons of mass destruction free zone, should that ever come about. Despite the vast divide between Israel and its Middle East neighbors, it is time to start building confidence. The meeting in Helsinki sought by Yaakov, my Finnish is pretty good, the Finnish Under-Secretary of State, will be a good place to start this difficult task, no matter what the magnitude of the differences. Diplomatic efforts that led to the NPT, the CWC, the BWC, and the CTBT show that progress can be made without settling larger political conflicts and disputes. Thank you.
Okay. Thank you very much, Milton. I think we have a little bit of time for discussion, and clearly I know that members of the panel would like to also react to the comments of each other. As far as I'm looking at this again, and against the background of 10 years of negotiations, let's say with Iran, what are the lessons can we learn from that experience of how is Iran under Rouhani different? What else is new? My question is, will my children and grandchildren have to deal with the challenges in the next 10, 20 years? I don't know if you want to pick up some of these issues now, or you want to wait for some of the questions of the audience.
You want to leave it?
Yeah, okay. Yes, Professor Frieder, a physicist from GW.
First of all,
Speak louder, or maybe you want to come up from.
So first of all, I'm a bit puzzled by the fact that Iran and Syria are somehow put in the same kind of perception. For the following reason: the ideological background of the two regimes are very different. And the type of leadership in the two regimes are very different. When it comes to Iran, it is really governed by the supreme leader. Everybody else is a puppet, selected and approved by the supreme leader. And the supreme leadership is basically Islamic. And what it means is that doctrines like the Bahir doctrine or any doctrine which allows reneging on agreement if the reneging act furthers the cause of Islam is considered moral, necessary, and appropriate. And we in the West don't look at it. That particular arrangement does not work as much for Syria because that regime, as Islamic as it may be, is far more secular. And the ideology there is the ideology of power rather than ideology of religion. Distinction number one. Distinction number two, although we call them weapons of mass destruction, or remember in the past we called them ABC. ABC is not American or Chinese, as you can think. ABC is atomic, biological, chemical. Although we put them together in one little box, there are three very different boxes because the technologies necessary to produce and to use and to hide, these three are different. It's very easy, essentially, to hide enough amount of chemical and biological weaponry. I can do it in my refrigerator. I don't, but I could. I cannot hide an atomic bomb in my refrigerator, and I cannot hide 20% uranium in my refrigerator. Too small. So putting all these together in one kind of approach is not conducive to the discussion. Point number one. Point number two, we are always talking about Syria, we are always talking about Iran. What about weapons which are in places like France or Great Ally, or Britain or Great Ally? How are we seeing the development of these countries in their relationship to extremism as time goes by and the population changes? This will not happen in 5 years. It will not happen in 10 years. But if you know enough of high school algebra, and you know enough about the population demographics in these countries, 50 years from now there will be no France. There will be Frankistan. And what that has an effect on long-range outlook, on control of weapons of mass destruction, is something we should consider today, so that over the next 50 years, development of policy can be done. I know some of you think this is very esoteric. Just do simple mathematical progression and look at the demographic changes in the population in Europe and see what effect it will have on long-range and short-range policy. I think I threw enough firecrackers into this audience.
Okay, thank you. Thank you very much for your comment. Any questions or comments? Tony Feinberg, you're quiet? No, okay. I'm not trying to put you on the
I'll ask a
corner.
question.
Yeah, okay.
Getting in, do you mean concerned about the security of nuclear weapons in France? Is this
Over the next 50 years,
Well,
yes.
security of nuclear weapons in Pakistan today. This is a great concern in the United States.
Right. I agree with you 100%. We should worry about it immediately. But we don't worry about it. We talk about Iran, we talk about Syria, which are immediate threats, I agree. But if we are going to develop policy, let's think about short-term and long-term.
The French know that we're worried about the security of their nuclear weapons. I would say better not to talk about it, considering what's happened with the NSA information.
Come on, they do the same thing. The
I'd
French
like to
security
go
is
on
doing the
another-
same
We don't
thing.
want them to know that we're thinking about this.
Right.
That's what I'm trying to say.
Okay, the dialogue between two physicists, I have a third one. This is Tony Feinberg.
I don't need to come, I just have a question.
Just another question, but you have to speak louder.
Okay, I'll try.
Good.
You don't have to sing.
Mr. Dwelter said something really interesting in passing, and I want to ask a little bit more elaboration on that. I believe you said, sir, that when the weapons and delivery mechanisms produced by Syria to the organization come out, they may be different from those that were actually found to have been used on site in suburban Damascus. What did you mean by that? In that case, who might have used them?
Well, I was being a little bit, just pointing out some potential discrepancies from the data, and you're quite correct to focus on that. The UN report, carefully looked at the munitions that were used. There were two types of munitions. They were not munitions that anyone assumed would be in the regular Syrian military's inventory. And what I understand informally from the inspectors are that they were munitions of that sort were not declared by the Syrians. I would point out that Sergei Lavrov has always made a case that chemical weapons had been used by insurgents. Lavrov is pretty smart, so I don't think he'd say something completely off the wall, although certainly in the case of the attacks of 21 August, there's a lot of data which has been made public which suggests that the Syrian government was in back of that. All I was really trying to suggest is that there's going to be some murky parts of this. From my experience in Iraq, during the period of the insurgency, there were munitions that looked a lot like, when I say munitions, I mean the rockets, that looked a lot like the ones which pitched up in Syria that came from Iran, either directly or they were Iranian designed. It was fabricated because they're very simple devices. So, I think as more and more layers of this onion are peeled back, there's going to be some confusing elements. One key thing I was pointing out is that control by governments of chemical weapons, we may be on a nice path, but it's going to leave the question of chemical weapons used by non-state actors is going to remain a big problem. The return address issue is going to be critical in this. While I'm standing here, I heard nothing from my other panelists that I disagreed with. I just wanted to highlight that in my comments, I was strictly speaking kind of about that very, very narrow problem of Syrian chemical weapons. What are Bashar al-Assad's incentives to step up to the Chemical Weapons Convention? I agree that he had to have an incentive. I suspect that Lavrov was making the case that said basically, dude, if you want any hope of hanging around for the next few years, you need to do something that'll increase your international legitimacy, while those groups which are seen as your opposition may decline in their appeal to the international community. So I would imagine that there was some thought logic that went along like that, which said, okay, in this case, as was suggested anytime, Mike, that chemical weapons were seen as a liability rather than something which was useful to deter other attacks. Let me just highlight one other thing. The role of Egypt and the condition of Egypt has been brought up. They're going to become kind of an outlier now in the Chemical Weapons Convention, but given all the other things that we and others have caused to happen with respect to Egypt, it's going to be very difficult for them to do anything. Certainly they've got bigger problems to deal with, some of which we've imposed upon them.
Greg, you want to
Yeah.
make it so quick to get the mic?
First of all, on the point that was made about the demographic changes in Europe, I think you're absolutely right. The United States policy as a government, of course, can't really talk about it because each of those governments and anti-American elements in those European countries would scream bloody murder. But of course it's true, but I would argue that the issue is not the security of their nuclear weapons programs, meaning the British and the French, because I think they are fairly well secure. And there's been little indication of infiltration by extremist elements into their military and security apparatus. However, it is the case, as we saw on 9/11 and beyond, that there are terrorist cells that continue to exist in Europe. And each of these countries, I was involved in the German Marshall Fund of the U.S., and they've been very, very proactive in examining these questions, especially in Germany. But each country in Europe has a different demographic problem or issue. And we won't get into this. It's actually fascinating, given what they're facing in Europe. But I really would be more concerned about the terrorism side of that. Charles, your points, because I was laughing when you talked about Russian foreign Mr. Lavrov. I mean, I'm sure you must have heard what Robert Gates said recently about the United States. Actually, I think this is Gates talking. He made the comment that President Obama was asked the question about would you trust Putin and Assad, and then Gates, with that interesting expression he always has, says, "You got to be kidding! Of course you're not going to trust them." But I'm also reminded of how Lavrov made a point of passing. He never passes an opportunity to embarrass the U.S. After the Boston Marathon attacks, they made a point of leaking or even speaking about the fact that Russians had warned about one of the two brothers that was responsible for that attack. And I wanted to say also, Milton, you had raised a number of interesting points, and I, given the limits of the talk, the last thing in the world I talked about was, given all the things we were trying to cover, was the issue of the regimes that we have in place for dealing with all the weapons of mass destruction. Congressional Research Service has this chart, which I have, which has all of the different agreements, all the different organizations involved in each of the different weapons of mass destruction problems. It is a long list. I keep it with me because if I have to, I may forget one or two. But the reality is that those regimes are extraordinarily important. I was a big advocate of no-mover when I worked in the Senate, as one example. What they do is they help identify problems, they identify transactions, and they also, by the way, serve as let's say, touchstones or catalytic events for coalescing alliances, multinational, international, dealing with bad actors. But when you talk about the key problems that we're facing in the world of these nuclear weapons, you're talking, as has been mentioned, about Pakistan, North Korea, Iran, and let's say terrorism. Maybe missing one or two, but those are the key ones that I would worry about if I were president. And unfortunately, those are the least tractable from the regimes. The regimes help us find things about those programs, but actually causing a change requires a motivational change. And Syria isn't in the end. Wouldn't it be great if the NSA was listening in on every conversation Assad had? That would be helpful to actually know the motivation that Syria has. When you look at the success stories that we've had in eliminating weapons of mass destruction, whether it's Libya under Gaddafi, South Africa, and let's even talk about Iraq, which Charles is the nation's expert on. In each of these cases, there was a motivational change. And the last thing that I want to do in the world is send Charles to Iran to spend a couple of years looking for their WMD programs. Let's remember how many years we were in Iraq and not really getting an answer to this question. I don't want that to happen.
Thank you. Okay. Mike, do you have last word?
I'll just say one sentence.
Okay.
On the demographics, rarely if ever do demographic progressions go in a straight line, and therefore we've seen in the Middle East there's a correlation between female education, later marriage, and fewer children. And so I don't think we should assume that Europe will eventually become, so it's just, that's a side issue, that's not really what we were talking about today, but I just want to put that out there.
I don't agree with you. But
Okay.
we can discuss it.
Okay.
Well, unfortunately, we cannot cover in great detail all these challenges. As I said, I'm afraid we'll have to deal with them again, whether it is the aspiring nuclear nations in the Middle East and beyond, or the terrorists, or even to discuss the Sunni-Shiite divide and how is it related to the nuclear. So far, we do have a Sunni nuclear power, Pakistan, and the question is if Iran, in the short term, would be able to obtain this nuclear capability, and what are the implications for that divide and international stability and security. Now, I would like to thank again my colleagues here at the ILI. I see Bill Mazier, who contributed to our work and studies, and also to thank the Potomac team. Lydia right here, who is recording, I think, the discussion that's going to be broadcast, and also Marianne, I see in the back, who is responsible for publications. And then we have Sharon in the back here with her team. I don't want to call them nursery because they're going to be the next generation of scholars and experts. I would like to thank everyone, and we'll keep you posted on what's happening. As I said, our next meeting is going to be on the 7th of November to deal with the challenge of terrorism and democracy. And I do hope that you will find it possible to join us. So again, panelists, thank you very much for your contribution, and the audience, and see you later.